අලුතෙන් SLT Mobitel Home 4G LTE connection ගන්න අයට වටිනා tab computers සහ data දීමනා. අලුතෙන් SLT Mobitel Home 4G LTE connection ගන්න අයට වටිනා tab computers සහ data දීමනා.
නව Tomex වැල්ලම් සහ විස බීජ අවම කර දින 3ක් දක්වා ටොයිලට් එක ෆ්‍රෙෂ්ව තමයි. Tomex.
Tonight, a stitch in time. Sri Lanka announces a preemptive negotiated default as it moves to avoid a hard fall.
Given the shortages of essential items for general public, we should not use whatever available foreign currency reserves to meet debt service obligation.
Hopes and expectations. Sri Lanka's ambassador to China says he's confident of $2.5 billion in Chinese assistance, as Finance Minister Adi Sabri explains what will happen in Washington.
When it comes to World Bank, yes, we have put forward a request for about 500 million immediately. When I go and meet the World Bank, I'm sure we can convince them to help us. So I'm optimistic on that.
Offering assurances. Professor Shanta Devarajan explains what it will take for IMF talks to succeed.
There are several state-owned enterprises like Sri Lankan Airlines that are bleeding the treasury, and there has to be a restructuring of those state-owned enterprises.
Poles apart, the Goldfest protest continues for day 4 as pro-government protests also pop up. All this and much more coming up on First at 9 this Tuesday, the 12th of April 2022.
Fair and Lovely men's වල අලුත් නම දැන් Glow and Handsome.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening, bringing you the latest current events from across Sri Lanka. This is First at 9 and I'm David Ebert. In our top story tonight, the government of Sri Lanka announced today that it is temporarily halting the servicing of all its external debts, a key move ahead of its restructuring program and one that will help prevent a hard default. This applies to all 4 categories of external debt, including all outstanding bonds issued in the international capital market and all bilateral credit between governments, excluding swaps.
The Ministry of Finance issued a communique early today on the government's interim policy regarding the servicing of Sri Lanka's external public debt. According to the communique, the government has taken the decision to temporarily suspend the servicing of its external debt leading up to the 12th of April. However, it added that all new credit facilities and any amounts disbursed under existing credit facilities after today will not be subject to the policy decision and will be serviced normally. The decision was taken according to the Finance Ministry in order to prevent the extreme deterioration of the country's financial position and ensure fair and equitable treatment of all its creditors. An assessment carried out by the International Monetary Fund has deemed Sri Lanka's external debt as unsustainable, making it clear that comprehensive restructuring is required. As such, the government's policy decision will apply to 4 categories of external debt. The suspension will affect all outstanding series of bonds issued in the international capital market and all bilateral credit between governments, excluding swap lines between the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and foreign central banks. Further, all foreign currency denominated loan agreements or credit facilities with commercial banks of institutional lenders for which the Republic or public sector is the obligator or guarantor also falls under this category. The final category includes all amounts payable to the country or public sector entity following a call during the interim period upon a guarantee issued in respect of the debt of a third party. In addition, the government expects to implement several measures in order to preserve the country's fiscal status quo until Sri Lankan officials can, with the assistance of the IMF, prepare a full economic recovery plan. To this end, the government expects to advance discussions with the IMF on an economic adjustment program and to post on the website of the Ministry of Finance all debt sustainability analysis and similar assessments prepared by the staff of the IMF or Sri Lankan officials. They also expect to engage in good faith discussions with bilateral and commercial creditors regarding the features of a comprehensive external debt restructuring plan that is in line with the requirements of IMF-based economic adjustment program. Finally, they also expected to be guided in the design and implementation of the external debt restructuring program by the principles of intercreditor equity with full transparency. Meanwhile, a media briefing was held later today to explain what the Ministry and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka expects from its policy decision.
we have come to a situation we have no other choice but to have what they call preemptive negotiated default instead of hard default, which would be the worst situation that we might face going forward. Given the levels of resource and also given the shortages of essential items for general public, we should not use whatever available foreign currency exchange resource to meet this debt service obligation. Instead, divert and use the scarce foreign currency resource that we are having now to support and finance very, very essential imported items like petroleum, gas, pharmaceuticals, medicines, all food items. I would expect the pressure on the currency to depreciate further should be stabilized, because now we are taking important part of demand out of the market. And also one other important direction we from the central bank issued today to the financial market is that mandated conversion of 50% of export proceeds. That was reduced to 25%. So whatever the export proceeds, those are converted by the commercial banks. Earlier requirement was that they have to sell that 50% to the central bank. Now they can use that 25% to prioritize to finance essential imports out of this 25%. So that certainly will help reduce what we call the black market premium. So what I request from those people who are going to the black market to finance their requirements, especially small ones, please go to the banks. Now there will be more foreign exchange available in the banking system. Don't go to the parallel markets. And I will also encourage from this point onwards, from the commercial banks, please facilitate these kind of essential requirements.
In the meantime, several opposition political parties have expressed shock over the government's decision to head for a soft default for the first time in the country's history. As such, the United National Party has called on the government to offer an in-depth explanation into how this situation came about, while the Samagi Janabalawegaya believes that the country shouldn't have defaulted in the first place. Meanwhile, the Jatika Janabalawegaya says that the political crisis has overtaken the economic crisis and raises questions on who the people can rely on in these trying times.
The Ministry of Finance announced today that it would be temporarily suspending servicing its external debt obligations today in an attempt to prevent the country from experiencing a hard default. In light of this announcement, several political parties expressed their opinion on the matter. As such, issuing a statement today, the United National Party expressed alarm over the government's announcement that they would be defaulting on all external debt repayments. They stated that never in the history of Sri Lanka has it ever had to default, and that the mismanagement of the government has caused the current economic crisis. The UNP stated that this move would cause undue pressure on banks who would have obtained foreign loans to facilitate letters of credit, as well as those who hold international sovereign bonds. As such, it states the government must present a complete explanation to the House on what led to the situation when Parliament convenes on the 19th of April. The United National Party also called for the establishment of a Parliament Select Committee, which will be tasked into inquiring why the currency was devalued prior to securing IMF funding, as well as the decision to delay restructuring the country's debt.
Now, whether they should have unilaterally announced they were going to suspend payment, it should have been avoided. We were supposed to solicit consent from our bondholders for a debt standstill, meaning with their consent we were going to restructure this. We were going to a soft default, a well-structured program. Here, suddenly, overnight, they issue a statement saying we are no longer paying. How are the bondholders going to react to this?
This is a very serious step for the government to take. The more serious question, though, is when there's such a severe economic crisis to be managed, whether we can do so given the kind of political instability that we are currently facing. The political crisis has, in a way, overtaken the economic crisis. However many decisions we make with regard to managing the macroeconomic situation, this is going to mean that in the short term and in the medium term, there are going to be severe costs that people will have to bear. Whether there's a political climate where that can be managed is, I think, the key question that is faced. Because to do so, people have to have trust in the government, and currently we don't have that.
Speaking to Bloomberg today, Professor of the Practice of International Development at Georgetown University and member of the Presidential Advisory Group on Multilateral Engagement and Debt Sustainability, Shantadeva Rajan, outlined 3 urgent steps Sri Lanka needs to take to avoid a hard default.
The first is to initiate a debt restructuring so that over time, they can actually meet with the creditors and agree on a reduction or an extension of the time profile or a reduction in the amount of debt they need to pay because they really cannot sustain the current level of debt. But the second is that while the debt restructuring is going on, Sri Lanka needs foreign exchange, as we've seen, because there are all these shortages of food and fuel and pharmaceuticals. So they need to negotiate or be able to obtain bridge financing from friendly nations to be able to get some foreign exchange reserves with which to buy imports. And the third is that Sri Lanka needs to work out a program of fiscal adjustment, of increases in taxes and reduction in public expenditure so that the fiscal deficit will narrow, so that Sri Lanka actually will be able to repay the new debt after the restructuring that is negotiated. This is what we would normally call an IMF program, that a level of fiscal adjustments that need to take place in order for the IMF to actually verify that the new debt is sustainable, that Sri Lanka can pay back the debt, but also that having an IMF program, as we have seen in other cases as well, brings in some fresh resources, both from IMF itself, but also that releases the possibility of budget support from the World Bank, from the Asian Development Bank, and possibly from some bilateral donors.
He also added that the success of Sri Lanka's IMF approach also lies on whether Sri Lanka can convince the IMF that it can implement the right reforms to fiscal policies, such as revamping loss-making state-owned enterprises and ensuring that it could end up paying off its debts ultimately.
The IMF, I think, has it right that with current fiscal policies, Sri Lanka is not going to generate enough revenue or generate enough fiscal space, that is revenue minus expenditures, in order to pay back the debt. So what we need to do is to increase revenues, and that's one of the assurances you give the IMF, that you can raise tax rates. And the other is to cut expenditures. And I spoke earlier about the subsidy reforms, but also the state-owned enterprises. There are several state-owned enterprises like Sri Lankan Airlines that are bleeding the treasury. They are running huge losses. And there has to be a restructuring of those state-owned enterprises, again, in order to prevent the bleeding out of the treasury, and that will generate some resources with which to pay back the debt.
In the meantime, Finance Minister Ali Sabri says that the Sri Lankan delegation for talks with the International Monetary Fund would be in Washington, D.C. from the 18th to the 24th of this month. He added that he expects to also meet with finance ministers of other nations as well to seek help. He also revealed that the World Bank has agreed to provide emergency funding of $10 million for the purchase of medicines, while it mulls over Sri Lanka's request for a further $500 million.
Finance Minister Ali Sabri confirmed today that Sri Lanka's delegation to Washington, D.C. will hold talks with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank between the 18th and the 24th of this month. He added that he will also look to hold discussions with finance ministers of other countries that might be willing to help Sri Lanka out as well. He also confirmed that the World Bank has agreed to provide an emergency disbursement of $10 million for the purchase of medicines, while it mulls over Sri Lanka's request for further $500 million in emergency funding.
In fact, we are planning to go to Washington from about 18th to the 23rd or 24th. During that period of time, we want to engage the IMF. Those appointments have been finalized. We are also finalizing the appointments with the World Bank. So what we try to do is during that particular period of time, meet those multilateral agencies, meet bilateral agencies, meet the finance ministers of possible countries who could help us, and to appraise them at the correct and genuine situation of the country. We are very clear from the day one. We are not going to give a rosy wrong picture. We will tell absolutely how it is and how it looks like, and accordingly we will try to convince them to come out with a program. That's one side of it. When it comes to World Bank, yes, we have put forward a request for about $500 million worth of support immediately. When I go and meet the World Bank in Washington, I'm sure we can convince them to help us. So I'm optimistic on that. In that, what we are looking at right now is to support the most affected. How do we look after them? How can we have a safety net to protect them? Secondly, since we have decided to restore the chemical fertilizer, how to get the fertilizer as a subsidiary going for the rest of the year. Then how do we ensure that seeds are being properly given to them so that the farmers can start their activities once again. Then other two areas of concern is how to supply the medicine without an interruption. Immediately they have agreed agreed to release $10 million probably in the coming week. That will help us to ease the burden right now, at least on some of the most essential medicines. And I'm meeting the WHO also at 3 o'clock. So hopefully we can negotiate and try to solve that. The other important area is the cooking gas. Cooking gas is a massive problem. So what we are planning is to do everything possible to ease this pressure on our public. So we have asked them to support us in order to import the cooking gas.
Sri Lanka's request for $2.5 billion from China is under discussion and could be provided to Sri Lanka in weeks, says Sri Lanka's ambassador to China, Dr. Palitha Kohana. Dr. Kohana adds that he has received assurances that the arrangements for the package are being processed at present, adding that China is one of the few countries that could help Sri Lanka very quickly. Sri Lanka's ambassador to China, Dr. Palitha Kohana, has expressed confidence that the $2.5 billion financial package that the Sri Lankan government has requested from China will come through. Speaking to foreign media, Dr. Kohana revealed that he has received assurances that the arrangements for the package are being processed at present. In March, the Sri Lankan government asked the Chinese government for an additional $2.5 billion in the form of $1 billion cash and a further $1.5 billion as a credit line. The government intends to use the $1 billion to repay an existing Chinese loan and the $1.5 billion credit line for the purchasing of raw materials and other essentials from China. Dr. Kohana added that he believes that the funding could come through within weeks, as China is one of the few countries that could help Sri Lanka very quickly. He stated that the delay is only because the request has to go through the Chinese system, but he was very confident that sooner rather than later, the two facilities will be made available. This, he added, would come through due to the nature of the Sri Lanka-China relationship, which he described as warm. And on that note, we'll be back with more local stories right after this short break. Stay with us.
Big 3.
Welcome back. Now, day 4 of the mass anti-government protests at Goldfest worked off today with no signs of the numbers reducing. This has also inspired similar protests in other areas of the country as well. In the meantime, protests in support of the government and the president were also held in some areas of the island, including Colombo, where a group of Buddhist clergy marched from the Nelumpokura Theatre to the entrance of the Viharamadevi Park. In terms of numbers, however, they were incomparable to the Goldfest protests.
A mass public protest at Goldfest urging the president and the government to resign continued today for the 4th consecutive day. The protest was joined by some members of the Buddhist clergy and some of the country's most famous artists as well. Further, associations representing lawyers too arrived at the site to support the anti-government protests as well. During the protest today, Venerable Dr. Omalpe Sobhita handed over a letter to the Presidential Secretariat as well. Last night's protest, however, took a tragic turn when Sri Lankan rap music artist Shiraz Rude Boy passed away after a musical performance from a sudden heart attack. In the meantime, several more anti-government protests worked off during the day. The Bar Association of Bandaravela protested today, echoing calls for the government to resign immediately. Meanwhile, several protests in support of the government were held in several areas of the country. One of them was a protest march organized by a group of Buddhist clergy in Colombo. The march began from the Nelumpokura Mahinda Rajapaksa Theatre and stopped near the statue of Lord Buddha, located at the Viharamadevi Park. However, numbers in support of this protest was a minimum level compared to the anti-government demonstrations. Further, several other protests supporting the government were worked off in the districts of Kurunegala and Matara today. Meanwhile, overseas, Sri Lankans residing in the UK staged a protest supporting the anti-government demonstrations in Sri Lanka. Similarly, several other protests organized by Sri Lankans were worked off in other countries as well.
Sri Lanka! Sri Lanka! Sri Lanka! Sri Lanka!
Meanwhile, the chief prelates of the three main Buddhist orders in the country have expressed disappointment with the country's parliamentarians for not delivering solutions even after a three-day debate in parliament. In an official joint statement following the discussions, the prelates have also accused them of focusing on political agendas which have exacerbated the crisis in the country. The prelates are to meet with all political leaders in the future. The chief prelates of the Malvatu, Asgiriya and Ramana Buddhist orders held a joint discussion at the Malvatu Mahaviharya yesterday. The discussions were focused on the current crisis situation faced by the people. Addressing the media afterwards, it was announced that discussions are to be held with the country's leadership as well as the leaders of all political parties in the near future on possible solutions.
පාර්ලිමේන්තුව තුළ දින 3ක විවාදයක් පවත්වා වගකිව යුතු මහජන නියෝජිතයින් ලෙස රට තුළ පවත්නා සමාජ ආර්ථික දේශපාලනික අර්බුදයන් පිළිබඳ මනා අවදිමත් භාවයකින් යුතුව ඒ සඳහා පැහැදිලි විසඳුම් ඉදිරිපත් කරනු ඇතැයි මහා සංඝරත්නයේ වශයෙන් අපි අපේක්ෂා කළද ජනතාවට සහන සැලසීම පසෙකලා ජනතා අභිලාෂයන් නොසලකා හැර වගකීම් විරහිතව මහජන නියෝජිතයින් කටයුතු කළ ආකාරය පිළිබඳ ත්‍රිනිකායික මහා සංඝරත්නයේ වෙනුවෙන් අපගේ දැඩි කනගාටුව පළ කර සිටිමු. පටු දේශපාලන අරමුණු පෙරදරි කරගනිමින් රට තුළ පවත්නා සැබෑ අර්බුදයේ පිළිබඳ අවධානය යොමු කර විසඳුම් ලබා දෙනවා වෙනුවට ඇතැම් දේශපාලනඥයින් විසින් සිදු කරන ලද අදූරදර්ශී ප්‍රකාශ මෙම සමාජ ආර්ථික අර්බුදය උග්‍ර කිරීමට හේතු වූ බව අපගේ අදහසයි. උද්ගතව ඇති වත්මන් අර්බුද සමනය කර ගැනීමට හා මහජනතාවට සහන සැලසීම උදෙසා රාජ්‍ය නායකත්වය සමග මෙන්ම පාර්ලිමේන්තුව නියෝජනය කරන සියලු දේශපාලන පක්ෂ නායකයින් සමග නුදුරේදීම සාකච්ඡා කිරීම අතිපූජ්‍ය මහානායක මාහිමිපාණන් වහන්සේලාගේ අභිලාෂයේ බව මෙයින් ප්‍රකාශ කර සිටිමු.
Meanwhile, with a booming black market trade for fuel being blamed for a major rise in daily fuel demand, the CPC has initiated raids on unauthorized selling of fuel. So far, 68 people have been netted by the police during the last few days, who have seized 8,025 litres of petrol and 726 litres of diesel. With that, the issuing of fuel in cans and barrels has been suspended until this Thursday, and special authorization will be required for agricultural and industrial needs. From today until the 14th of April, all refueling stations have been ordered by the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation to refrain from issuing fuel in cans due to an artificial rise in the daily demand for fuel, especially diesel. According to the CPC, previous daily diesel demand used to be 5,500 metric tons. However, this has now increased to 7,500 metric tons. The CPC also says that a black market for fuel has also been created by some individuals, and this could be the reason for the increase. With that being the case, raids have been carried out to arrest anyone found selling fuel without an authorized license, and according to police, 68 suspects have already been taken into custody, along with 8,025 litres of petrol and 726 litres of diesel. CPC Chairman Sumit Vijay Singh said yesterday that from now on, new rules will be introduced for anyone requiring fuel to be filled in either cans or barrels.
කුසිකාර්ම කටයුතු සඳහා ඉන්ධන අවශ්‍යතාවයක් තිබෙනවා නම් ප්‍රදේශයේ ඉන්න කුසිකාර්ම පරිශ්‍රණ නිලධාරී මහත්මයා ප්‍රාදේශීය ගොවිජන සේවා නිලධාරී මහත්මයා ග්‍රාම සේවා නිලධාරී මහත්මයා මගින් අපිට අනුමැතියක් සහිතව පැමිණියොත් අපි ලබා දීමට කටයුතු කරනවා. ඊට අමතරව නිෂ්පාදන සේවා කර්මාන්ත සඳහා ඉන්ධන අවශ්‍යතාවයක් තිබෙනවා නම් ප්‍රදේශයේ ප්‍රාදේශීය ලේකම්තුමාගේ අනුමැතියක් ලබාගෙන ඉන්න ඕන ඒක ලබා දෙන්න.
In the meantime, earlier with long queues having primarily been for diesel, currently queues for petrol too have become as long as those for diesel. However, the CPC chairman continues to urge the public to avoid queuing up for petrol as sufficient supplies exist at filling stations.
පෙට්‍රල් සාමාන්‍යයෙන් 4100ක් 200ක් අතර ප්‍රමාණයක් තමයි දිනක පරිභෝජනය. අපි මේ ප්‍රමාණය අපි ලබා දීමට කටයුතු කරනවා. පෙට්‍රල් කිසිදු හිඟයක් පසුගිය කාලය පුරා ඇතුනේ නැහැ. දැනට ඇත්තෙත් නැහැ. අපිට අවශ්‍ය තරම් පෙට්‍රල් ඉන්ධන තොග අපි සතුව තියෙනවා. ඒ නිසා කිසිදු පෝලිං ගත වීමක් අවශ්‍ය නැහැ.
Speaking further, the CPC chairman also said that the CPC has not taken any decision to increase fuel prices despite incurring massive losses.
කන්තේ නීතිගත සංස්ථාව හැටියට ගත්තොත් සංස්ථාව ආනයනය කරන මිලට වඩා අඩු මිලකට තමයි දැනට අලෙවි කරන්නේ. නමුත් කන්තේ නීතිගත සංස්ථාවට අවස්ථාව ලබා දීලා නැහැ. අවශ්‍ය පරිදි මිල වැඩි කරන්න හෝ අඩු කරන්න. මේ වෙලාවේ අද දවසේ මිල ඩීසල් ලීටරයකින් රුපියල් 110ක් පාඩු. පෙට්‍රෝලෙන් රුපියල් 52ක් පාඩුයි. රුපියල් මිලියන 800ක් 17 අතර ප්‍රමාණයක් දිනකට පාඩු. මිල ඉහළ දැමීමක් සම්බන්ධව තවමත් රජයේ හැටියට කල්පනා කරලා නැහැ.
Meanwhile, confusion reigns as to whether Sri Lanka has sufficient drugs and medical devices or not. The Department of Government Information, quoting Health Ministry today, confirmed that there are sufficient quantities of drugs and medicinal equipment at government hospitals. However, according to the State Ministry of Production, Supply and Regulation of Pharmaceuticals, the country is short of 52 essential medicines and 2 life-saving drugs.
The State Ministry of Production, Supply and Regulation of Pharmaceuticals told AdaDerana English News that the country is still in need of 52 essential medicines and 2 life-saving drugs. The State Ministry said that they have sought assistance from the World Bank and the World Health Organization in supplying the drugs that are in short supply. Further, the State Pharmaceutical Corporation has also requested state banks to open letters of credit up to $10 million. The shortage is evident as some hospitals say that they are running out of essential drugs and medicinal devices. However, in this backdrop, the Department of Government Information released a media communique quoting the Ministry of Health, saying that there are sufficient quantities of drugs or medical equipment at government hospitals. Along with the statement, there was a list of quantities of drugs and medicinal devices available at several hospitals in the Western Province. The only mention was the availability of the endotracheal tubes both with and without holders with different sizes. This now leads to the creation of more confusion as to what is the real situation pertaining to the drug availability.
The Ceylon Electricity Board Engineers Union has announced that it is withdrawing from all activities connected with unsolicited proposals, including the New Fortress Energy deal. The union has issued a clarion call to other state sector employees to join them and help defeat corruption within the state sector system. According to a statement issued by the CEB Engineers Union, it has decided to take immediate action against what it called the unsolicited proposal mafia by withdrawing from all activities pertaining to such proposals on power projects. Accordingly, with immediate effect, the union will not perform any activities connected with such unsolicited proposals, including those connected to the New Fortress LNG procurement deal. The CEBEU has also called on authorities to reinstall proper administrative and good governance practices and stand against the conduct of what it termed a handful of individuals, including the present CEB chairman who has facilitated unsolicited deals, they allege. Furthermore, the union called on all professionals, officials and state sector employees to follow suit and help rebuild the country with positive changes. The Sinhala and Tamil New Year 2022 is set to dawn on the 14th of April, and if you aren't sure of what this year's auspicious times are, here's a breakdown of the list.
Less than 36 hours remain for the dawn of the Sinhala and Tamil New Year 2022. A festival celebrated by the majority of Sri Lanka that is enriched with a series of customs and traditions that our ancestors have practiced for millennia. The auspicious times allocated for each ritual of the Sinhala and Tamil New Year are as follows. The inauspicious time, or the Punya Kala, where people refrain from any work or commercial activity, falls between 2:17 am and 3:05 pm on the 14th of April. The public are expected to engage in religious observances during this period. At 8:14 am on the same day, the Sinhala and Tamil New Year dawns, and the lighting of the hearth is said to be carried out at 9:05 am, during which the time the traditional pot of milk is boiled. This also marks the preparation of milk rice. At 10:17 am, families will be expected to gather round their table of traditional New Year sweetmeats. The first monetary transaction, or Ganudinu Kirima, is supposed to take place between the elders and the youth in the families. Following this, the tradition of the applying oil for good health and long life is said to be carried out at 7:04 am on the 17th of April. Finally, those engaged in employment will be expected to leave home at the auspicious time of 6:51 am on the 18th of April. Now, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka announced the official exchange rates for today as the Sri Lankan rupee depreciated further against the US dollar. According to the central bank, the official exchange rate of a US dollar, the selling rate now stands at 319 rupees and 20 cents. The buying rate of the US dollar, meanwhile, is listed as 329 rupees and 99 cents. On Tuesday, the 5th of April, the official selling rate of a US dollar exceeded the 300 rupee mark for the first time in Sri Lankan history. In the meantime, several leading licensed commercial banks in Sri Lanka have declared their selling rate of the US dollar at 335 rupees. And that's all the news we have for you tonight. We hope you join us tomorrow at the same time. Good night.